Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday I do my best of one, best of three meta review, and we're on to the 6th week of Duskmourn. And what I'm going to do is talk about the top performing decks according to Untapped in best of one, cover the top 8, and then talk about the top 8 in best of 3 based off of the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. So I like this because it's a data-based approach, not really a matter of opinion, and always good for just interesting ideas for your own brews as well. So the number one top performing tier 1 deck according to Untapped is Mono Red Aggro, and this list I was a little skeptical of because it's a small sample size, but I ran it earlier today for a 68% win rate in Platinum, just starting my ladder climb up into Mythic, and it's doing quite well. It's doing the thing. So this one is not running the Screaming Nemesis, and instead is running the Cunning Coyote. And the Cunning Coyote allows you to plot, similar to like the Slick Shot Show Off, to be able to give something haste. But it gives you another follow-up as a 2-drop to your Heartfire Hero. So instead of Heartfire Hero into Manifold Mouse, you can also do the Cunning Coyote to target the Heartfire Hero and trigger the Valiant. And it gives you a lot of pressure, gives you an additional threat that your opponent has to deal with. And so since we're not running the Screaming Nemesis, which is what you'll see a lot of times in the best of 3 list, and it's the Screaming Nemesis is a fine card. The version of this deck that's running the Screaming Nemesis is also doing very well. But because we're dropping that, we're dropping the Witchstalker Frenzy, which has nice synergies with being able to shoot the Screaming Nemesis. And instead we're running 2 copies of the Blooming Blast, which allows us to kind of have an additional Lightning Strike, being able to hit them for 3 damage if you give them the treasure. And also 2 additional copies of the Demonic Ruckus. And I think the plotting, bursting, the Cunning Coyote gives a really interesting feel to the deck, and I definitely think you should check it out. And as far as the lands go, dropping it one mountain here, and it felt about right, because the Rockface Villages don't really play a whole lot like a whole land. They play more like a combat trick to trigger your Valiant. So the other thing that I like to do during these meta reviews is talk about the matchups, in case you're returning to Standard and this is all new to you. So this deck is favored against Golgari Midrange and Azorius Oculus and Dimir Control. It's a coin flip against Mono Black Discard, and it's weak to Boros Auras. Number 2, also in Tier 1, from Bronze to Mythic, was Selesnya Rabbits. And we've talked about this one a fair amount throughout the weeks because it's been around since Bloomburrow, and this deck is preying on the decks that have single point interaction like Mono Black. And we do see a slight change this week from last week, and that is that the Cavern of Souls is being dropped down by 1 to bring in an additional planes. And, you know, it kind of makes sense with, like, your hop to it. You can't cast off the Cavern of Souls, like the Season of the Burrow with the double pip white. So I can see that being an okay change, especially because there's not a whole lot of counter spells in the meta right now. And as far as its matchups go, it is favored against Golgari Midrange and Dimir Control, Mono Black Discard, and Azorius Oculus, but it is weak to Boros Auras. Number 3, also in Tier 1, was Mardu Aggro. This is the one that I used to hit Mythic last season, and it has undergone no changes since last week when we talked about it last. And it's favored against Dimir Control, Azorius Oculus, and Mono Red Aggro. It's a coin flip against Golgari Midrange, and it's weak against Mono Black Discard. And since we've talked about these decks a fair amount, I'm kind of going through them a little bit faster. If you want to look back at the previous weeks, I go much more in depth about each specific card. So I'm just going to try this out as a change of pace, because I really want to get to talking about best of 3. So Boros Auras was number 4, and this one was the top performer in the previous weeks. It's now kind of fallen down to the bottom of Tier 1, which is still very good and still very easily, you know, can climb to Mythic easily. And we do see a couple of changes that kind of going back and forth between the weeks. So Demonic Ruckus being dropped by 1 here to bring in an additional copy of the Feather of Flight, and this one just kind of coming down to like the card draw in a different way and evasion in a different way. So very similar kind of effect out of both cards. And then the lands, we dropped 2 Inspiring Vantages to bring in a mountain and a plains. And really, I think that one is just kind of like, I doubt it's a heavy impact into the archetype, because this is really only painful when you're already past 3 lands, and you're usually ending the game pretty quickly with this archetype. So as far as its matchups go, it's favored against Azorius Oculus and Mono Red Aggro, and it's a coin flip against Golgari Midrange and Dimir Control, which has the single point interaction to kind of disrupt the strategy. And then it is weak to Mono Black Discard, which attacks the hand as well as has the single point interaction in black. Rakdos Aggro was number 5 at the top of tier 2. And so it's still kicking around, even though they lost the Leyline of Resonance. This deck still has the capability of doing a turn 3 win, and still has quite a bit of spice to it. Maybe not as broken as the Leyline version, but we can see that we've made some adaptations since the last time I talked about it. It had the Leyline of Resonance, so this time around the bringing in 2 copies of the Emberheart Challenger and the 4th copy of the Monastery Swiftspear, and dropping all 4 copies of the Might of Meek, as well as the 4 copies of Shock, to bring in 4 copies of Dreadmaw's Ire, and that really helps with the turn 3 win on the Slick Shot, then flinging it at your opponent with the Sellsword. And we're bringing in 2 copies of the Urabrask's Forge. This helps up against some of the mono black discard stuff that kind of preys on this deck that can be a little bit weak to the Urabrask's Forge. And as far as the lands go, we're dropping the black entirely, so no Blazemire Verge, and instead we're just running 20 mountains, so we're bringing in 4 mountains. And I think it's a little bit high, but if you're going to bring the Forge in, then you need to be a little, be able to hit turn 3 or 3 mana, so bringing up the land count kind of makes sense. And this one is favored against Mono Red Aggro, being able to outrace them with the Callous Sellsword, Azorius Oculus, which doesn't have the interaction to disrupt this strategy, and Dimir Control, which is also running into that same kind of problem. It's a coin flip against Boros Auras. It really depends on whether or not they get the Sheltered by Ghosts on turn 2, and whether or not they're on the play or the draw. And then it's a coin flip against Golgari Midrange as well, depending on if they draw into their black interaction. And it's weak against Mono Black Discard. So Mono Black Discard is looking like a pretty good meta breaker as far as preying on a good chunk of the top performing decks. But then it itself struggles and doesn't usually actually make it into the top 8 because it has some bad matchups. All right, this one we'll spend a little bit more time on here. This one's number 6, is Boros Convoke in tier 2. And last week I talked about a budget version that was performing well according to the tracker, and this is more of like the upgraded version that you would expect to see. So it's running the Knight Errant of Eos, the Imidane's Recruiter, the Sanguine Evangelist. The War Leader's Call is in here to help up against midrange and control, ping your opponent every time that one of your tokens enters the battlefield. We've got the Warden of the Inner Sky to be able to tap your artifacts, and the Novice Inspector to set up the Gleeful Demolition. Notably, this build is leaning a little bit further away from the turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos and leaning more into the turn 3 Knight Errant of Eos, and going a little bit more into value and mid-range with the Split Skin Doll and the War Leader's Call. So, interesting approach. Painter's Studio is sometimes included in this list, and it's not in this one. But Arabella is one that I haven't seen being played in Boros Convoke, and it makes a lot of sense because all of your little tokens are going to make Arabella hit for a ton of damage. So, kind of extending away from the turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos into a little bit more of a mid-range strategy. But the general theme is still there. Blow up an artifact, convoke Knight Errant of Eos, hit Imidane's Recruiter, push in a bunch of damage. And similar to Selesnya Rabbits, this is also punishing the go wide or the single point interaction strategies of black by going wide. And so both the Selesnya Rabbits and Boros Convoke are then weak to the sweepers like Temporary Lockdown and Sunfall and Split Up and such. Pyroclasm. Oh, and I forgot to mention that Boros Convoke is not a particularly popular pick. You're not going to bump into it a whole lot. But it is weak to Boros Auras, not really having the interaction to stop their Sheltered by Ghosts kind of strategy. Number 7 here is Gruul Aggro, and this one is also in tier 2, and It is also weak to Boros Auras, and this one is a little bit different though than what we have seen in the past, which has been more of a Gruul Prowess build, focused on the Slickshot Show-Off or the Leyline synergies. And this is leaning more fully into like a Delirium strategy that we got in Duskmourn. So we have 4 copies of the Wildfire Wickerfolk. We've got the Fear of Missing Out, which helps you discard a card to get that Delirium enabled. You also have the Patchwork Beastie, which mills a card, Seed of Hope, which helps enable the Delirium. You also have Breakout, which gives you some really nice dig, and the Keen-Eyed Curator that allows you to exile the cards, pinpoint precision, or your opponents if you're playing up against Azorius Oculus, to get that +4/+4 and trample. So it's a way to kind of also get payoffs off of your Delirium. Rin and Realmbreaker also helps enable that by doing the self-mill on the downtick for -2. And then we have some interaction with the Obliterating Bolt to deal 4 damage and get rid of a problem, like the Haughty Djinn in Azorius Oculus. Kinker Bloom is a one of here, allows you to self-sacrifice to destroy an artifact or an enchantment, or just proliferate, but that helps you get a creature into the graveyard if you're having issues with that. Usually you don't, because your opponent's killing all of your creatures, right? Cenote Scout, also with the Explorer, helps put cards into the graveyard, helps enable the Delirium, and then the Violent Urge, giving you double strike if you have the Delirium enabled. Allows you to hit in for a ton of damage. Also, Fear of Missing Out, not only does it enable it, but it also gives you a payoff for Delirium, being able to give you an additional combat phase, which can just win with the Violent Urge. So, really cool. I haven't personally bumped into this deck a lot, and the sample size was pretty small, but I definitely am excited to check it out, since I'm only missing one, one copy of the Wildfire Wickerfolk. And number 8, according to the tracker, in Tier 2, was Jeskai Convoke, and this one also small sample size, but have seen this performing well in best of 3, and this is a best of 3 list. Painter Studio, like I mentioned, for Boros Convoke being decided to play here. Sheltered by Ghosts has also been making it into the archetype, so if you don't want to do the Arabella, you could run the Sheltered by Ghosts in the previous list. But the point of this deck is you have increased inconsistency from bringing it into 3 colors, but the payoff is that you have a more consistent turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos, which helps you race up against the temporary lockdown, which is one of the deck's weaknesses. And Clockwork Percussionist and the map token give you more targets for the Gleeful Demolition, and then Mockingbird allows you to either copy Imidane's Recruiter or any of these to enable your early plays to be able to kind of pop off with the deck. And then Case of the Gateway Express, similar to Boros Convoke, is the one piece of interaction that also works as a board pump along with the Painter's Studio. So if you haven't checked out Jeskai Convoke, a lot of the go-wide strategies are doing pretty well right now, I think, because of a lot of people playing mono black. All right, now for best of 3, and for the best of 3 decks, what I like to do is look at the standard challenge tournaments on Magic the Gathering Online. I think we have some really top players on there, like Mogg, Rem F, Ariane, just a bunch of names that if you follow the tournament scene, you're probably familiar with. But this one was Dimir Midrange by Rowdy Gaines, took down first place on November 1st, and we're going to compare a lot of these decks to Worlds and see whether or not they were running the Worlds list or if they were kind of making their own adaptations to the Worlds list. So there were 2 Dimir Midrange lists in Worlds, and one of them was running the Slasher, the other one was not. So I'm going to compare it to the one that was not running the Slasher. And we do see some changes. So they decided to not run the Urtai Resurrected, the Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, or the Sheoldred the Apocalypse, and instead are leaning fully into Enduring Curiosity to get the value off of the early cheap flyers like Deep Cavern Bat, Fairy Mastermind, and Spyglass Siren. And also bringing Preacher of the Schism up to a full copy of 4, which really helps kind of solidify it as it's a nice mid-range threat, giving you a lot of value. We're dropping the Bitter Triumph and instead running the Anoint with Affliction, and an additional copy of the Go for the Throat, as well as an additional copy of 3 Steps Ahead. And so more interaction, less creatures, and dropping the Mirrex and Restless Reef and 2 Swamps to bring in Fountain Port. So it's pretty common to see either Fountain Port or Mirrex being played, and then bringing in an Island and an Underground River to kind of reflect the additional leaning away towards to reflect the changes in the interaction. So the best of three sideboard also got some changes. Dropped the Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal and the 2 copies of Ghost Vacuum, Malicious Eclipse, and the 2 copies of Withering Torment to run a 1 copy of Blotout, which is a really nice counter to the Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal if they have some form of problematic creature. Enduring Curiosity tends to be the highest one too, so it's a good way to kind of exile it and get rid of it in the mirror match. And so giving you a nice tool in the mirror match with the blot out. And bringing in 2 copies of Duress. Going to bring this in against like non-creature spells that decks that have a large amount of non-creature spells. And you've also got an additional negate, which is helpful up against the non-creature spell lists and the wraths. And then we also have the 3 copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse. And I think this is really going to be the card that you bring in if you need stabilization against an aggro strategy, because this deck is drawing a fair amount of cards, and Shieldred the Apocalypse then can convert that into life. Oh, and I forgot to mention real quick, the matchups. It's favored against Golgari Midrange and Domain, kind of depending on what version of Dimir Midrange you're talking about. And so we'll see kind of the matchups change a little bit as it reflects the changes that we saw in Worlds. But typically, Dimir Midrange is good against Golgari Midrange and Domain. And it's a coin flip against Azorius Oculus, and then it's weak against Mono Red Aggro and Gruul Aggro. And so this is pretty common where the #1 deck in Worlds is then going to become like the largest percentage of the meta share in best of 3 for a little bit. So we're seeing a lot of Dimir Midrange, and it's been performing well, so there's a reason for it, right? This one was 2nd place on November 1st, Dimir Midrange by Hamuda. And if we also compare this one to the Slasher version at Worlds, then we can see that they brought in an additional copy of Kaido, Bane of Nightmares. They dropped 1 copy of the Enduring Curiosity and a Tishana's Tidebinder to bring in 3 copies of the Flood Pit's Drowner. And we'll see later RimF also running this build. And the Flood Pit's Drowner, I think, is a nice inclusion to this one, fitting into the tempo strategy quite well. 2 copies of Mockingbird, which we've seen in Dimir Midrange before, being able to copy some of your early flyers fits into enabling your Gix or your Enduring Curiosity. And then this one's leaning further away from the interaction, so dropping the Go for the Throats, or 1 Go for the Throat and 2 3 steps ahead. And also tweaking the lands to reflect those changes, so dropping the Restless Reef, the Underground River, the Swamp, and bringing in an island and an underground sewers. So the best of 3 sideboard, we've got 1 less blot out. So it's kind of weird because like the sideboards actually kind of feel crisscrossed, and like this person took the slasher build and tried the sideboard from the other one, and then vice versa on the deck that we just covered by Rowdy Gaines. So no blood out, no cut down, or cutting 1 cut down, 1 disdainful stroke, and a Shieldred the Apocalypse to run Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, which was in the sideboard of the other one, and then Harvester of Misery, which helps up against the go wide strategies like Jeskai Convoke, and also running the 2 copies of the Malicious Eclipse. So deciding to lean more heavily into the sweepers in the sideboard. All right, and now we've got Mono Red Aggro by Gasman48, and this one was 1st place on November 2nd. And if we look at the changes from Worlds, we see none. So this was kind of what I was talking about in Best of 1. This would be the Screaming Nemesis version that's running the 21 lands with the Witchstalker Frenzy. And this is performing well in Best of 1 as well. And it performed well in Worlds, and so not much to talk about here. Talked about it a fair amount, even did a sideboard guide for it in the community tab. So it's favored against Dimir Midrange and Golgari Midrange, Gruul Aggro, Azorius Oculus, and Domain. So it's very well situated, especially for the MTG ladder, which is a little bit, people are a little bit more laid back as far as like properly sideboarding against Mono Red Aggro, which then helps improve its stats. All right, 2nd place on November 2nd was Gruul Aggro by Mana Chow. And if we compare this one to Worlds, we do see that they kind of basically made it mono red, right? So they took out the Questing Druids, the Slickshot Show-Off, they brought in the Hired Claw and the Screaming Nemesis that we see in mono red. and took out the Scorching Shot, 2 Might of the Meeks, 2 Snakeskin Veils, and the 2 Torch the Towers to bring in 4 copies of Lightning Strike and the 3 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy, and dropping the Innkeeper's Talent. So why are we running the green? So we also lowered the amount of green that we're running. So we took out the Carplusian Forests and the Restless Ridgelines to just run some more mountains and the Rock-Face Villages. The green is only in the sideboard here for the Paw Patch formation, and this is a particularly nice card against decks like Domain, Azorius Oculus, Slick Shot show-off versions where they have a flyer that you can destroy. So it's probably worth playing the green, right? At least a way to go about it. So compared to Worlds, they dropped an Obliterating Bolt, so still have 2, but not running 3. And I think 2 is okay for countering Azorius Oculus, which is, I think, primarily when you bring this card in. There's a couple of other matchups that work well for it as well. Dropping 1 copy of the Paw Patch formation instead of a full playset of 4, dropping the Questing Druid in the side, as well as the Scorching Shot to bring in 3 more copies of the Lithomatic Barrage, and this one definitely helps up against Azorius Oculus. Also works up against Zur and Domain, and depends on kind of what you're bumping into. Bring it in during white and blue, right? And I've got 2 copies of Torch the Tower. This is pretty good against the Slasher version, the Dimir Midrange that's running Slasher, and then Enduring Curiosity, being able to exile both of those kind of problematic sticky threats. So you don't really need to tech against it, though, right? I mean, it's also useful for against like the mono red matchup and the other Gruul Aggro matchups to have additional shocks, basically. And it's favored against Dimir Midrange, it's a coin flip against Golgari Midrange, and it's weak to mono red aggro, kind of being basically the same version, but with more inconsistencies in the mana. All right, well, there's 2 tournaments on November 2nd, so this is the second set. This was Dimir Midrange by Rem F, who is kind of the Dimir Midrange master of the standard challenges. And so if we compare this one to Hamuda's list, instead of the Worlds, I think it's easier to do that for this one. Kaido, we're keeping it to 2 copies, so not bringing it up to 3, only running 1 Mockingbird instead of 2, and keeping the Tishana's Tidebinder in the list, and then adjusting the lands a little bit differently, so dropping in an island and underwater sewers to bring in the Manland of the Restless Reef and a swamp and an underground river. So very similar lists to one another. The sideboard has 4 different cards, so also very similar to the list that Hamuda was running. This one dropping the Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, dropping the 2 copies of the Ghost Vacuum, which is kind of a tech card against Azorius Oculus or decks that care about their graveyard, and dropping the Harvester of Misery, which helps up against like Jeskai Convoke, and bringing in the Blot Out, which I mentioned is good for the mirror match, bringing in the Disdainful Stroke, and this one helping out against cards like Sunfall, typical like a domain counters domain strategies, leyline bindings, things like that. Bringing in an additional copy of Gix's Command, which kind of helps out against the go wide strategies, stabilize against the mono red with the lifelink, and bringing in 1 additional Shieldred the Apocalypse, which also helps stabilize against the aggro matchups. And second place on November 2nd was Orzhov Midrange by Batutina. And this one's a new archetype with a familiar core, right? So a lot of the Dimir Demons deck that like the one that won first place, right, was kind of a black core centered around the Unholy Annex and the Archfiend of the Dross and that wonderful synergy, right? And so this is leaning into white instead of blue, and blue is basically just for Fairy Mastermind, and Temporary Lockdown and Legions to Ashes really helps attack the go wide strategies of like Jeskai Convoke, and the rest of it though is a very familiar black core. And the sideboard, we've got Cruel Claw's Heist for like hating on their controls hand, additional Legions to Ashes if we're up against a tokens deck. Kaya Intangible helps up against like Sunfalls, gives you a thing that planeswalkers don't get hit by wraths. Dreams of Steel and Oil helps up get rid of the Urbrask's Forge from your opponent's hand. Same thing with like Duress. And Exercise gives you the artifact or an enchantment hate, and then Rest in Peace is the answer for Zoroark's Oculus to give you the graveyard hate, and then Shieldred the Apocalypse to help stabilize against an aggro matchup. All right, and on to the third, which is the biggest tournament of the weekend. So this was first place on November 3rd was Dimir Midrange by EJK, and there's no changes to the list from Worlds, including the sideboard is exactly the same as we covered last week when I covered the Worlds decks. So that one's nice and easy. And the last one that we'll be talking about this week is Gruul Aggro by L1X0, another familiar name in the tournament scene. And they took down second place. And if we compare this one to Worlds, this one's a little bit more similar in the sense that like they didn't cut all of the red and make it into mono red, or cut all of the green and make it into mono red. We do see some changes though, so they dropped the Scorching Shot and the 2 Torch the Towers to bring in 2 copies of Bushwhack, and I thought that was an interesting one to include, being able to kind of help you if you're not hitting the lands that you want, but also being able to have one of your things fight one of the others. And Screaming Nemesis is a pretty good fighter, because if you can, remove a 2/2 with the Screaming Nemesis or one of the like dorky flyers in Dimir Midrange, then you also prevent them from being able to gain life, right? And you can even like 2 for 1 if depending on the board state, right? So there's some good synergies there. I like that inclusion. And bringing in 4 copies of the Lightning Strike as well to give a little bit more reach in a different way than Innkeeper's Talent, which I think is smart because Innkeeper's Talent is more easily disrupted than the Lightning Strike, which needs to be counterspelled. And the mid-range not working particularly well with the Innkeeper's Talent. And dropping 1 Restless Ridgeline, but still keeping 1 in the deck for up against the mid-range and control matchups, and instead just bringing in 1 Mountain. So the best of 3 sideboard, we've got the going down 2 on the Paw Patch formation, which may not be the right choice, just considering that Paw Patch formation was the card that was worth splashing green for in the Gruul Aggro deck, right? But the Pick Your Poison plays very similar to the Paw Patch formation, giving you kind of an edict. It's a sorcery and it's 1 cheaper. I actually did a sideboard guide for the Gruul Aggro strategy as well, and I like having the 2 Pick Your Poison and Paw Patch formation, so you can reference that in the community tab if you kind of want to see which matchups I was playing it in. And we're dropping the 4 copies of the Urbrask's Forge, which I thought was interesting because I feel like Dimir Midrange has got to be a pretty popular pick in the tournament, and Urbrask's Forge is a pretty good one against Dimir Midrange in my experience. So thought that was an interesting one to have dropped from this list, and is running the Innkeeper's Talent, which I would have had the Forges instead of the Talents, I think. But bringing this in sideboard in favorable matchups that don't have as much interaction or enchantment hate. And the Pick Your Poisons, which I mentioned, is kind of like Paw Patch formation, but slightly different. And then the Questing Druid has been added, so an additional copy of the Questing Druid to the sideboard. And I actually like the Questing Druid as a sideboard option instead of in the main. So when I've been playing around with it, this was many seasons ago, I must admit, but what I was trying out was Questing Druid, starting it in the sideboard and bringing it in during the matchups that are advantageous, where usually it's off of like if they lack interaction to destroy an early Druid that's growing out of control, or if it's more mid-rangey and you need the Seek the Beast kind of extra value or extra dig. And so we've also see a copy of the Snakeskin Veil, so we can go 3 full copies of Snakeskin Veil, and 2 additional copies of the Torch the Tower. So we're definitely bringing in a lot of tools for those Urbrask's Forge that are missing. And again, good for exiling problematic sticky threats, Mosswood Dread Knight, cards like that. So hope that helps you, get acquainted with the best of 1, best of 3 meta if you are returning to Magic, and if you are one of my weekly viewers, thank you. And I hope it helps you understand the archetypes at a deeper level. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me in the comments below. And next week will be the release of Foundations, so I will not be doing a video on Monday. I will try to do my brews if I get around to them next week. Otherwise, we're going to have like a hiatus until we'll talk about what's going on in the first week of Foundations. So take care, everybody. Good luck with your ladder climbs, and I'll catch you all later.